Death from Above, an Artifacts and Enigmas Mystery by Darran Handshaw. 88 AR, the 51st day of Reap's Call. The workshop door slammed open with such a resounding crack that Actaeon nearly fell from the top of the ladder. He'd finally gotten around to trying to decipher the problem with the ventilation system at the peak of the building's vault. It hadn't been quite the same since the fire, and kept getting stuck when he tried to crank it open from the workshop floor. "Where are you, engineer?" came an unfamiliar voice from below. "There's been a murder. I need your aid." "Last I checked, I am an engineer, not an investigative agent of the law," called Actaeon as he steadied himself on the ladder and started to climb back down to the second-floor loft that stood above the most of the central workshop floor. "It would be best if you spoke with the arbiters about the matter. You have come to the wrong place." "On the contrary, my new friend," countered the voice. "I'm precisely where I need to be, for you are the exact expert I require for this type of murder." Actaeon started down the stairs to the ground floor with its scattered inventions and partially dismantled artifacts covering the many workbenches. He was genuinely surprised at the person who waited for him. The tall man was shaved bald right down to the pate. A pair of lenses in a crude frame was perched upon his crooked nose, behind which were shrewd cobalt eyes that scrutinized everything around him. Dark brows accentuated his gaze and was complemented by a straight brown beard the length of a hand, shot through with white in two places. He wore a gray cloak over a plain gray tunic, black vest, and gray trousers that were tucked into knee-high leather boots. The red armband on his right arm was emblazoned with the interlocking shields of the Order of Arbiters. With his right arm, he leaned heavily upon a cane of polished wood, and at his right hip was a ceramic scabbard that confirmed what the faint smell of ozone in the air suggested was the presence of a writhe blade. "Apologies, Your Grace. He insisted on speaking with you immediately," said Companion Yanel from the doorway. The red-haired warrior leveled her striking eyes on Actaeon, giving him a look that said she'd remove the man immediately if he wanted. The companions served as the guards of the royal family of the Raydell Dominion, and Yanel had been assigned to Actaeon since the Second Invasion War. In fact, she was one of the reasons he was still breathing. "No need to apologize, Companion Yanel," said Actaeon with a grin. "The Arbiters are our friends and allies, after all. I am sure that this gentleman has a perfectly good reason for nearly startling me off of a ladder." The man arched his brow and smirked. "Perhaps if your companion truly valued your well-being, she would have been up there footing your ladder instead of trying to interrogate arbiters on official investigations." Yanel scowled and opened her mouth to voice her displeasure, but Actaeon forestalled her with a gesture. "I presume this murder you speak of was committed with some form of artifact or invention, or else you would not be in my workshop, Knight Arbiter," theorized Actaeon. "Knight Investigator Aethelgard of the Order of Arbiters," he corrected with a wave of his cane. "And quite astute of you, engineer. If you care to join me, I would show you the scene of the murder." "That's Prince Engineer to you," snapped Yanel. "You are speaking to His Grace, Prince Engineer Actaeon Relios Caliburn of Raydell." "Bah!" scoffed Aethelgard. "I don't care about the prince part. It's the engineer whom I seek." Actaeon grinned. "Well then, you know what the important part is, Knight Investigator. Please lead the way. I shall do what I can to help." The murder scene was just below the pyramid's pinnacle, inside a room that opened up like the jagged maw of a wild beast to the broken northern descent. There was a long wooden table with a disarray of chairs scattered about it on both sides. The remnants of a large feast were left on the table and were now surrounded by buzzing flies. Some of the food had fallen to the floor, and more than one tankard had been spilled. The pool of dried blood upon the end of the table and floor closest to the open northern face of the room suggested that the victim had died there, although the arbiters had removed the body earlier that day. The pair of arbiters guarding the entryway parted to let Actaeon and Aethelgard through. Companion Yanel joined the arbiters outside. Aethelgard gestured with his cane for Actaeon to follow him. He righted a chair that had been on its side near the bloody mess and spun it around so he could sit leaning forward against its back. "All right then, engineer, tell me, what do you see in the scene before you?" Actaeon narrowed his emerald eyes and looked around the room for a few long moments before replying. The person who was killed was standing at the head of the table, perhaps speaking to everyone else. However, they were killed. It appears to me that nobody present expected it, because they all moved away from the table in a rush, spilling drinks and overturning chairs. "A rudimentary but accurate assessment," said Aethelgard, his eyes flicking about the room intently. "Care to enlighten me further?" asked Actaeon with a grin. He leaned forward on the shaft of his halberd expectantly. "Of course, my good engineer," said the night investigator. He stood then and began to point with his cane as he explained. "The killer, who was much shorter than the victim, approached from behind and fired a single crossbow bolt through our victim's heart at near point-blank range. The victim then fell upon the table and bled out. Those present, who had been listening to an impassioned speech from the victim, at first recoiled with the horror of the murder that unfolded before their eyes. Then many of them stood to pursue the killer, but, being prepared as they were, the killer fled to the north and leapt from the room to safety in a manner wholly unexpected by those present." "A manner wholly unexpected," parroted Actaeon. "What makes you certain?" He made his way over to the broken edge of the room. The shattered steps of the northern descent were visible far below, and out beyond that was the ruinous expanse of the boneyards, stretching toward the mountains of Charon far to the north. Aethelgard stood to join Actaeon, where he lowered himself to a crouch. "See these bloody streaks? Partial boot prints from two men who ran through the blood that had spurted from our unfortunate victim's wound. The marks on the floor before them show that they were running toward the killer, in pursuit, no doubt. The last marks are streaks because they slid to a stop after the killer leapt into the air and took off like a bird with some manner of artifact." Actaeon took a step back, astounded. "A flying artifact? While I suppose it is possible, nobody has ever seen nor heard of evidence of such a thing." "What makes you surmise such a possibility? And while we are at it, how could you know that the pursuers were men and not women?" The night investigator barked a laugh and shook his head. "You surprise me, engineer. I surmise precisely nothing. Everything I have said to you thus far has firm evidence to support it. I have studied such things for a lifetime, and so it is simple for me to see that the length and spacing of their strides are indicative of men. A woman's stride would generally be shorter and almost always narrower, as a matter of commonality to the fairer gender. Perhaps it is to keep pace with men, who typically have longer legs? Anyway, it matters not, for you will observe this in most all cases. Additionally, in the taking of their narrower strides, women also rotate their hips more, which can be evident in increased lateral drag as their foot presses against the ground." Aethelgard paused then, looking about, while Actaeon narrowed his eyes upon him in what could only be described as a conflicted combination of interest and skepticism. Before Actaeon could speak, the arbiter clicked his tongue and pointed to the left side of the opening. "That's the one I was looking for. See those marks? Those were made by a woman who also stepped in some of the victim's blood. Notice how the marks are closer together, and how you can see a smear toward the center line of her gait. You'll observe that she stopped well before sliding off the edge. Many of the fairer sex are also the wiser sex as well." He laughed at that and used his cane to regain his feet. "I could see that your hypothesis might hold correct with these limited examples, provided you found the person associated with each," said Actaeon. "However, I still cannot fathom how you determined that the killer flew off on a flying artifact. Care to explain that?" Aethelgard shrugged. "You'll see the truth of it soon enough. I suggest you watch people's gaits as you travel the city, if you're truly interested. As for our little killer Birdie, that is even more clear. When you look down to the level below, you'll observe the blood stain from another pursuer who leapt after our killer and plunged to their death below. They leapt so far out over the northern descent that the only conclusion is that the killer ran off at a great speed and continued at least beyond the distance that their unwise pursuer leapt to. And judging by the early testimonies of the witnesses we've detained, and the fact that there are no additional bloodstains down there, I can only determine that our culprit took to a flight of sorts as part of their escape. Actaeon leaned carefully over the edge and spotted the place where the person had died in the broken portion of the pyramid far below. He straightened and turned to look up into another broken room above the one they stood in. So the killer dropped down from above then? Actaeon's lips curled into a thin smile, and he nodded with a satisfied tug at his beard. Indeed, now you're thinking, engineer. And there's evidence that they had camped out in the room above for quite some time, waiting for the perfect opportunity, no doubt. So you've no thoughts on what could have been used in the escape? Actaeon unshouldered his recurve bow and put its scope to his eye. With it, he slowly swept the ancient runes in the distance. Once he was satisfied, he slung the bow back over his shoulder. There are one or two locations where a person using a flying device might land. Of course, it depends on the method of flight they achieved. If they glided upon the winds like a bird, as you describe, then they would need a relatively flat landing location to dissipate their momentum, lest they break their legs upon landing. It also strikes me that the killer might have been waiting up there for the perfect wind conditions to arise for a flight to enable their escape. Ethelgard pushed his lens frame up along the bridge of his nose. The Sentinel Arbiter was right that I should contact you. I'm glad of this. So, should we venture into the boneyards to examine your potential landing sites? Actaeon shook his head. First, I would prefer to gain a higher vantage than this. The Song of the Sisters? Asked Ethelgard, speaking of the inn and restaurant at the pyramid's pinnacle. Even higher, said Actaeon. Higher than the top of the pyramid? Ethelgard cast the engineer an astounded look. Aye, and I think I know how to accomplish it, said Actaeon with a grin. But first, do you have a witness who I could ask some questions of? I've just the one, in fact, said Ethelgard. We've detained a woman who was intelligent enough to stop when she realized what was happening. She was clearly possessed of the greatest power of observation present at the time. Shall we see what we might glean from her? Actaeon smiled and nodded. Lead the way. On the way back down into the pyramid, Ethelgard explained the rest of the details of the case. The group of people present, 27 in total, during the murder were all Chernians, members of the fallen dominion to the north. Most surviving Chernians had joined the new hold of Wither and Raydell through an agreement which Actaeon had brokered, and these people were ones that he hadn't heard of before. The murder victim was a man named Kragan, who was a Chernian shield warden, one of the right-hand men of a warlord, before the cataclysm of the Blue Sphere, as it was coming to be known. The witnesses who Ethelgard had interviewed all called Kragan their warlord in exile, but they wouldn't say much else about him, or why they were there. The witness who had been detained was a Chernian woman named Gerdas. She had not been quite so forthcoming as Ethelgard had desired during the first interview. The night investigator led Actaeon and Yanel down through the sky spiral along a twisting staircase that arced high above the sun chamber below and eventually curved its way into the pyramid's great western tunnel. The way led past the sea lounge, which Actaeon was altogether familiar with, and down farther until they reached the entryway to a chamber that had always been sealed shut. Ethelgard lifted his cane in front of Actaeon to halt him before he could go inside. "Hold. There's something you must know about the Rainbow Room." "The Rainbow Room?" asked Actaeon. "I've never heard of such a room in Pyramid." Ethelgard smirked. "That's because I hadn't wanted you to know about it. Now, listen carefully. The room changes color based on the emotions of any persons inside, which, in short order, will include ourselves. Thus, you must endeavor to eliminate any semblance, however minor, of emotion from your mien. Instead, become a study in stoicism, something which, as an engineer, you should have little trouble with. If you can manage this, then we shall see how the colors of the room will change, and it will reveal our witness's feelings in response to what we say to her. Since she has thus far refused my every effort in interrogation, we must now incite her to emotion, to see what insights we might capture from her reaction." "Fascinating," said Actaeon with a grin. "By what mechanism do you suppose the room uses to determine the emotion? I wonder if it is similar to how the Veiled One and Yanniker manipulated minds. It would be interesting to study this further." "It matters not," said Ethelgard, "and no study of the room will be permitted beyond that of the emotions of anyone being interrogated inside." "Matters not?" exclaimed Actaeon. "The knowledge could save the people of Redemption from future instances of mental manipulation. You do not care about that?" "My only interests lie in solving the crimes committed within Arbiter-protected territory," explained the night investigator. "Anything else is outside my purview." Actaeon blinked and ran a hand through the disheveled black hair behind his goggles. "Incredible. Lead on, then. I shall endeavor to avoid asking you anything that requires too much of a digression from your interests." Actaeon laughed at that and pushed his lens frame farther up the bridge of his nose. "I shall lead on. When you control your present emotion." He narrowed his dark brows and offered Actaeon a pointed look. The engineer realized he'd been staring at the night investigator in wide-eyed disbelief. He grinned and shook his head. "Very well, consider it done." With his offhand, he gestured for the knight to proceed. The bald arbiter nodded in satisfaction, and any sign of amusement vanished from his face. He assumed a blank look that penetrated his expression right down to a dead stare from his cobalt eyes. Ethelgard became the embodiment of indifference, the paragon of apathy, and then, lifting his cane, he rapped it against the door 3 times. The door slid open, and an arbiter emerged and saluted. "Night Arbiter Ethelgard?" "Night Investigator, thank you," corrected Ethelgard. "Aye," responded the arbiter. "The witness waits inside as instructed." "Very good," said Ethelgard. "You may wait out here." The arbiter nodded and stepped outside to join companion Yanel, who offered him a bewildered shrug. The night investigator led the way inside, and the prince engineer followed. The Rainbow Room was a nondescript, conical-shaped room about 20 paces across. It terminated in a rounded point at the very top, which appeared to stretch an impossible distance above their heads. Its walls were a uniform light pink color, but quickly changed to a mild orange hue. At its center was a single chair, where sat the witness. There were no other furnishings to be seen. Ethelgard came to a stop several paces before the woman, and Actaeon paused at his side to lean on his halberd. The witness was a Chernyan woman with dark skin and piercing black eyes. Her head was shaved with the exception of 3 strips of very short hair that ran from front to back. She wore simple brown leather armor and sturdy boots. She tried to stand but failed when she was quickly reminded that her hands were lightly tethered to the arms of the wooden chair. Her eyes narrowed, and she fixed them on Ethelgard with a glare that could shoot daggers. The room shifted to a bright red. Actaeon noticed that the color drifted down from the top of the cone to replace the previous orange. "Glad I could assuage your boredom, Gerdas," began Ethelgard. He rapped his knuckles lightly with his cane, as though making a point. "You wouldn't be tied up here if you'd cooperated with my investigation. For all I know, you were working with the killer all along. After all, we already know that you were the least determined to pursue the killer. Or else, why would your footprints show that you hesitated while everyone else rushed forward until the moment the killer made their leap? A sickly brown color washed down to fill the room. It made things dim, but not dim enough to see Gerdas lean forward and spit at Ethelgard's feet. Such guilt, Gerdas, goaded Actaeon. It reads clear upon your face. I see I must have struck a nerve there. You must have helped kill Cregan. Even if we don't catch the killer, at least we'll have one guilty party for the chopping block. He offered her a thin smile then. Gerdas struggled against her bindings and kicked out, which shifted her chair. The room flared red, a dark hue this time, which cast an eerie light upon them all. I didn't kill Cregan, you peeking fool, spat Gerdas. I'd not have killed my warlord. Any guilt I feel is I couldn't run that bitch through with my blade. Ethelgard leaned upon his cane and looked up at the point of the ceiling far above. Your warlord? I thought all the warlords in Charon were dead. The last Chernian warlord died in battle at the side of my friend here, or at least that's how the story goes. The color shifted to a deep shade of purple, and Gerdas bit her lip until it bled. Cregan was... She paused then and shook her head. Cregan was going to change that, suggested Actaeon, breaking his silence. How? By retaking Charon with 27 warriors? You have a place in Raydell, you know, in Wither. We made a new home for you. It was one of the final things Warlord Burke did before he died. The room turned a dark shade of pink, and she spit this time on Actaeon's boots. We'd sooner drown in a shit-filled latrine than live under the thumbs of you southern sods. And so you fell in with this Cregan, said Ethelgard, the man who would be warlord to restore that which you all lost. The pink shifted to a deep, healthy green color that cast a verdant light upon all of their faces. If you knew Cregan, you'd have understood, said Gerdas. But a woman who flew from the top of the northern descent prevented that, said Actaeon. She took your leader from you. And with that your dreams, added Ethelgard. The room returned to the deep shade of purple that Actaeon guessed was grief, but just as quickly, the room changed to a sickly magenta hue. You are angry. So what? Chided Ethelgard. It's clear you won't do a thing to help us with it. He turned his cobalt eyes to Actaeon and nodded to the door. Let's go, engineer. We've more important things to attend to. When the men turned to walk out, Gerdas cursed under her breath. Fine! They paused at the word. Fine, wait, I'll tell you what I know. So long as you do everything in your power to catch Cregan's killer. Ethelgard smirked and tapped his cane on the floor several times before turning to face the Chernian woman once more. Catching killers is what I do. What can you tell me about his killer? The color shifted again, this time to a yellow-orange. A tiny one, maybe a girl even, said Gerdas, dark blue robes that she pulled the crossbow from, and a hood that hid most of her cursed face. Saw a lock of blonde hair, though. The yellow-orange shifted to a light pink color. Ethelgard shot Actaeon a look, and the room shifted in color once more, this time to a dull reddish shade. What can you tell us about how she flew away from the ledge, Gerdas? Asked Actaeon after offering the night investigator a shrug. Any details you can remember may be important. Gerdas shook her head. Bitch leapt like a bird to air, and when she opened her arms they got longer. That and her robes got longer with her arms, like wings of a bird. She glided right off on them. And did she do anything before that happened? Asked Actaeon, intrigued. Did she touch anywhere on her body or make any strange gestures? The woman shot him daggers with her eyes. Are you deaf? I said she jumped off and opened her arms. They got longer. That's what I know. Actaeon shook his head at her response and opened his mouth to ask another question. He was stalled when Ethelgard tugged at the sleeve of his jacket. Let's go. We're done here. Done here? Repeated Actaeon, confused. But Aethelgard offered Gerdas an apologetic look. Perhaps he is deaf, as you suggest. The Chernian woman barked a laugh. The room turned a faint shade of green then. Actaeon grinned. Point taken. Who would want to kill a Chernian warlord? Asked Aethelgard. The pair of them walked back through the sky spiral to the eastern side of Pyramid, with companion Yenel lagging behind. At Actaeon's suggestion, they were going to visit Shard, the Althean herbalist, in the Terrace of the Stars, a massive open-air garden that occupied a large portion of the pyramid's eastern face. A Shieldian? Or an Ajmani? Someone afraid they would come to take their lands back, no doubt, suggested Actaeon. I'm afraid it's much simpler than that, my dear engineer. The night investigator tugged at his beard. Simpler how? Asked Actaeon. You'll see soon enough, was Aethelgard's enigmatic response. I do not suppose you could just tell me? Suggested Actaeon. Aethelgard smiled thinly. And what would be the fun in that? You have a strange idea of what is fun, Night Investigator. I investigate crime and murder every day. Would you expect anything less? They found the Althean herbalist toward the bottom of the terrace. With a rake, the herbalist battled a thorny garden of hardy plants along the bluffs of the Therian coast. Found along the bluffs of the Therian coast. The androgynous gardener turned toward the two men as they approached and regarded them critically, with eyes sunken into a mass of wrinkles. Best ye be here and help all Shard, said the Althean. Else off with ye. I'm sure a sister of the Triforge wouldn't mind helping a night investigator with his investigation, said Aethelgard. My engineer friend here has some questions for you. Ain't no sister, snapped Shard, waving the rake toward them threateningly. When the two men didn't leave, Shard lowered the rake and sighed, turning those beady eyes on Actaeon. All you do is ask questions, eh? Spit 'em out, then, before I make you weed this damnable garden. We are curious as to the weather yesterday. What can you tell us about the conditions? In particular, we need to know which way the wind was blowing, explained Actaeon with a grin. Shard squished their eyelids together in a struggle to recall the conditions of the day before. When the Althean's eyes opened, they lifted the rake and pointed. Out the north. Blew all day like that. Clouds spoke of rain, but none was shown. Just strong wind blowing south. Actaeon looked surprised at that. He leaned heavily against his halberd. A northerly wind. One could not fly into that so easily. The technology used must have been able to overcome it. Interesting. Ain't no bird going to fly against wind like that, argued Shard. No point to it. Waste of energy. Birds'll go with the wind or not at all. Actaeon turned to Aethelgard. An artifact that could fly into strong winds like that must have had some manner of propulsion. Gerdas said the killer had glided. Glided, not flapped wings, mused Aethelgard. Aye, said Actaeon. I wonder if the artifact was similar to the projector orb that Cryo uses, he suggested, mentioning the leader of the Loresworn. That's what you're here to figure out, said the night investigator. Actaeon narrowed his eyes. Perhaps next time you might allow me to finish questioning the witness instead of cutting me off. Aethelgard settled his shrewd, cobalt eyes on the engineer. You'd have not gotten any further with her. Besides, even if you had, she hadn't the eye that you have. A discernment of detail toward artifact technology isn't something that comes naturally to most in Redemption. A light, a shape, a noise, all of these things might have provided me a clue to the artifact, which, despite any lack of understanding of technology, would have been simple matters to an ordinary observer. Actaeon shook his head and gazed up at the sky. Point taken, engineer, said Aethelgard. I'll not cut you off in the future. Please do not. Out my garden, snapped Shard, again waving the rake at them. I ain't got no time for this nonsense. You got no more questions, then be gone. I've work to do. The herbalist turned about and strode off, heading toward the next challenging patch of garden. They watched as Shard hobbled away on stumpy legs. So, what does Shard's stride tell you, Night Investigator? Actaeon grinned. You've got me there, engineer, said Aethelgard. I'm as stumped as those legs. It took the better part of the next day and several dozen tests of miniature models to construct what Actaeon had in mind. Yanel and Wave, Actaeon's mercenary friend, were sent in search of supplies from the open markets. Meanwhile, in the workshop, Actaeon put Aethelgard to work, helping him sew massive sheets of bright weave together. The material couldn't be cut by normal implements, and so Actaeon had Aethelgard use the tip of his writhe blade to pierce the sheets at intervals so that a thin glass rope could be threaded through to join the bright weave sections together. In addition to being woven together, the folds between the bright weave sections would help prevent air from escaping easily. While the Night Investigator was so employed, Actaeon set about constructing a frame with help from Lauren, his engineer in training. As she used steam to bend the thin bands of light wood to the shapes that Actaeon had drawn up, Actaeon worked on making an investment casting that would form the shape of a sturdy bracket to hold one of Lauren's light lances. The lances were long pole artifacts that, when activated, could emit an intense orange beam of light that would destroy nigh anything it passed through. In the past, Lauren and her light lancers had turned the tides of a war with the artifacts, but now, Actaeon intended to use one of the light lances for a completely different purpose, as an engine for flight, or so he hoped. The frame was constructed in several rings that could be assembled on site, and as Lauren finished each section, she rolled it over to the waiting cart, driven by a boy named Salif, the grandson of the old carter they had used on many occasions. After pouring the molten metal into the mold, Actaeon set to work on the final component while he waited for it to cool. He lifted his goggles from his eyes and began to sketch out the details. It would be a circular bench with a floor where one's feet would be. The size would allow up to 3 people to sit comfortably together as the device was in flight. The back of the bench would also double as a railing in case any passengers needed to stand to tend to the lines or the light lance. Actaeon sketched out grab handles periodically and added cleats to the outside for the tying off of ropes. The next day, when everything was assembled in front of the workshop, quite the crowd gathered to see the strange apparatus that the Prince Engineer was building in the outskirts. Even the Princess of Raydell, Asandra, had come to see her engineer take flight, accompanied by a contingent of companions and their infant daughter Edwina. She stepped forward to embrace Actaeon and wish him well. I think I'll stay on the ground, said companion Yanel, looking up at the device skeptically. The circular passenger carrier sat upon the ground. It was made from woven materials and some light woods that Lauren had selected to keep the weight at a minimum. To one side of the carrier were the rings of the craft, surrounded by a small fortune in bright weave. The resulting shape looked like a gigantic inverted cone. At its narrowest point was an opening with a metal bracket ready to accept the device that would power it. Well, I'm not missing it for anything in the world, proclaimed Lauren excitedly. She leapt into the carrier and inserted her light lance into the bracket before closing the latches that would secure it. Actaeon grinned and gave Asandra and Edwina each a kiss before climbing into the carrier to join Lauren. Rope minders, to the ready, he called out. Everyone stay clear. If this fails to work properly, the wind might drive it in any direction. Thankfully, the air was still at the moment and the skies were clear. It was a good day for this test. Best of luck, engineer, said Aethelgard from where he stood near the edge of the crowd. He tugged on his beard as he leaned heavily on his cane. Well, I appreciate the sentiment, Night Investigator, said Actaeon. You must needs be joining us as well. The Arbiter smirked and removed the lenses from his face to clean them on his vest. Oh no, I have no need to risk myself on this trial. After all, who would solve the crime if your invention does fail? You needed me to accompany you on the inspection of the crime scene and interrogation of the witness, did you not? Asked Actaeon. Precisely, began Ethelgard. Because you might have observed something that I had He trailed off as he realized Actaeon's point. I'll join you for the actual flight, of course. No need to risk a trial. And if something happens to me during the flight, will you know how to work all the controls? Asked Actaeon with a grin. Ethelgard replaced his lenses and offered a thin smile in reply before shaking his head and limping over to the carrier to climb within. And so, for the second time in known redemption history, will humankind attempt to grace the skies with our presence, announced Actaeon to those gathered. Lady Lauren, will you please do the honors? Proudly, exclaimed the young woman. She touched the pair of activation panels on the light lance that extended horizontally into the bright weave cone. The lance crackled to life, and a beam of energy extended into the bright weave. Lauren began to count. After she reached 11, the cone began to lift into the air. By 20, it was nearly vertical. Lauren shut off the lance and reset her count to 1. The cone began to drift toward the ground slowly. We should have created a bracket that allows 2 lances, said Actaeon. If this works, we'll be able to do that quickly, said Lauren. Just don't ever mix up which lance is cooling down. What would happen if that were to occur? Asked Ethelgard. Lauren finished counting to 30 and touched the panels. The lance crackled to life again and filled the air around them with the scent of ozone. Their hair rose up in response. We would explode, she answered matter-of-factly. Ethelgard's cobalt eyes widened, and he looked back at the ground outside the carrier in consideration. Before he could move, the carrier jerked, and he was thrown down onto the bench. The hot air float lifted into the sky and bounced as the tethers that held them to the ground stakes became taut. Give it a few rounds of beam light, Lauren. I want to make sure we have enough lift before we let out the tether, Actaeon instructed. Aye, aye, Act, said Lauren, following his orders. After the 5th operation of the lance, the ropes were beginning to creak and stretch under the strain. Rope minders, release the ropes, called Actaeon, and the ropes tethering the lift cone to the ground were released to hang free from the apparatus. Actaeon untied one of the 3 ropes tethering the carrier to the ground and fed it through the 2 sets of double pulleys that were hooked to the bottom of the carrier and the light lance bracket respectively. The rope was anchored to the ground and ran through the center of the carrier basket to a neat coil under one side of the bench. He tugged the free end of the rope through the last pulley on the bottom and pulled it taut before tying it to one of the inside cleats. The pulley system would give him a 5-to-1 mechanical advantage to better control the ascent. That done, he untied the other 2 ropes and the lift began to bob to and fro along the single remaining rope. Ready? Actaeon asked his fellow passengers. Am I ever, said Lauren, beaming. She activated her lance again. If I must be, responded a less enthusiastic night investigator. Actaeon began to untie the knot from the cleat. He left it wrapped around the cleat once for extra friction and let the rope out slowly. The apparatus rose into the air, and the gathered crowd gasped. Nothing of the like had ever been witnessed in Redemption, at least not by those currently residing there. As Actaeon let out more and more rope, the lift continued to rise until it was even with the observation walk along the top of the workshop's vault. And then, short moments later, it was above even that. He continued to let the rope out until they were about twice the height of the workshop above the ground. I could see the end, Act, said Lauren, referring to the tavern at the far end of the avenue of glass, and to the great sea on the other side. Ethelgard gripped the seat of the bench so hard that his knuckles turned white. Are we ready then, engineer? Yes, smiled Actaeon as he waved down to his wife and daughter far below. Yes, we are. It took another day to set up the tethered hot air float lift back at the murder scene. Ethelgard had numerous night arbiters present to act as tenders. They struggled to prevent the cone from sliding down the side of the pyramid until Actaeon showed them how to tie off the ropes in various places within the murder room. Once that was done, the process of assembling the lift went more quickly. Starting with the top of the frame and working their way downward, they carefully slid the parts into place within the Brightweave skin. When the assembly had been completed, the float lift cone hung upside down from its tethers atop the jagged edges of Pyramid's broken northern face. Actaeon was glad he'd decided to make the float skin from Brightweave. The material of the ancients was nearly indestructible and wouldn't tear as it was pushed against the broken fragments of Elderstone and shards of Elderglass below. Aethelgard tugged at his beard skeptically and reseated his lenses upon his nose. "What now, then?" "We right it, of course," said Actaeon with a grin. He slid the extra light lance that Lauren had lent him into the bracket and clamped it into place. "Since the float lift is upside down, we shall need to make sure the hot air doesn't escape until it is righted." He unfolded a nearby section of Brightweave that he'd fashioned for just this purpose. In it he stepped, like a child ready to run a sack race, before shuffling over to the bottom of the cone beside the passenger bench. Actaeon offered a grin to Aethelgard's arched brow, and then disappeared as he pulled the Brightweave sack over his head. He coupled that end to the opening of the cone and fastened it into place with a few spring clips. Aethelgard turned to Yunel and tugged at his beard. "What in shattered redemption is he doing?" The companion smirked. "Ac's got a plan. He always does. You'll see." Inside the giant Brightweave cone, Actaeon interlocked his fingers and stretched them before pulling his goggles down over his eyes. "Here we go," he said to himself, as he reached out to grab the 2 activation areas on the light lance. The heat that followed and funneled up from the cone toward him was wholly unanticipated, but painfully obvious in hindsight. The blast of hot air singed his hair and eyebrows, nearly causing him to lose count of how long the lance had been on. Once he realized what was happening, though, he steeled himself, and even though wave after wave of heat washed over him, he could feel the cone's entrance tilting, which meant that the entire cone must be lifting up as well. In addition to the incredible heat, there was ozone, a byproduct of the light lance beam. As he breathed in the gas-filled air, he coughed and felt his chest begin to tighten in reaction to it entering his lungs. He bit down on his lip and held his breath. After the hot air filled his sack, it pushed downward to fill the Brightweave cone, offering aerial buoyancy to the lift. And no sooner than the cone floated to the horizontal orientation did he feel tremendous relief as the hot air and ozone from the light lance's beam began to fill the large volume of the rising structure instead of relentlessly assaulting him. He hazarded a breath and was rewarded with warm but infinitely more breathable air. While the cone continued to rise, he undid the clips of the sack until it fell at his feet. He reached a count of 20 life beats a moment later and shut off the light lance. Yunel stepped forward to steady her charge. "Your Grace, are you all right?" she asked, concern evident in her striking green eyes. "Aye, Yunel," said Actaeon with a grin. "Victim to a poorly thought-out idea, but nevertheless I persist." "And yet your idea appears to have worked," observed Aethelgard. "Quickly," said Actaeon as he hopped into the carrier basket. "We ascend at once." Aethelgard limped over to join him and climbed in himself. "Are you coming?" he asked Yunel. "Oh no," she answered. "Somebody has to find you two if you splat into the ground or go flying out to the great sea." "Comforting," answered Aethelgard. "Here, hold this." He handed her his cane and then held tight to the back of the circular bench with a white-knuckle grip. Actaeon activated the light lance again, and the basket jerked upward. The hot air float lift was soon straining against the tethers, while the two men dangling beneath it in the carrier. The night arbiters unhooked the tethers at Actaeon's command, leaving the device dangling upward against the final tether that ran through the center of the basket. Actaeon wrapped 2 loops of a safety rope around his waist and tied it off to one of the cleats. Unsteadily, Aethelgard did the same. "Ready?" asked Actaeon. "Let's get on with it, engineer," said the night investigator. "Try not to get us killed." Actaeon grinned and unhooked the main line from its cleat. With care, he began to let it out through the pulleys. and they started to rise into the air. The ascent hastened further as he activated the light lance system again. The great elderglass face of Pyramid's Peak angled away from them as they climbed upward. The midday sun gleamed off to one side, throwing up a coruscant veil of light that made them avert their eyes. To the west, the great sea stretched far into the distance, an endless expanse of rolling blue waves. To the east, the underforest stood tall, its tremendous trees jutting upward from the very ruins of the city. To the north, the mountains beyond the firmer Chernian holes loomed like jagged teeth. It was from that direction that came the wind. It was sudden and unexpected. The speed with which the pyramid rushed toward them was astounding. A crack sounded as the bright weave envelope struck the elderglass. Less than a light beat later, the carrier basket hit the glass, and one of the benches broke free and slid off to the right. Both men clung to the remainder of the carrier and one another in desperation. In the chaos, Actaeon lost his hold on the rope, and the float lift began a runaway, wind-driven ascent up along the slope of the pyramid. As they slid along their uncontrolled path on the outside of the ancient structure, they could see inside the pyramid clearly. The shocked faces of people climbing the various stairwells near the top of the sky spiral sped by at an alarming speed as the wind buffeted their backs. Actaeon saw an arbiter point to them and pull out her whistle to blow it before they passed her by as well. The wind pushed them sharply to the right, and then they were above the Song of the Sisters, a restaurant and inn near the top of the pyramid. Noble men and ladies leapt up from their restaurant tables as the strange device came hurtling up past them. Many of them opened their mouths in a scream that couldn't be heard from the outside. A waiter dropped a tray of drinks on the table in front of one of the groups of nobles, soaking them all in a calamity of broken glass and alcohol. Then they were past the restaurant and sliding their way past personal rooms. A naked noble woman powdering her nose in the elderglass wall of her room stumbled backward in shock. In another room, a pair of entangled men in mid-coitus, beneath the slanted elderglass wall of their room, threw themselves from their bed in terror. After a life beat, one of them covered his manhood, while the other lifted his hands to hide his face. Aethelgard laughed. "Bet they didn't expect us to come flying past them." "Indeed," said Actaeon with a smirk. "It would be most interesting to be a fly on the wall to hear the conversations this will inspire." We'll be a smash fly against the side of the pyramid if you don't stop us, engineer," reminded Aethelgard. He began to shake Actaeon with the hand that was clutching his jacket, urging him to take action. "Ah, right," said Actaeon. His eyes drifted down to the rope that was flying through the double pulleys as the wind drove them upward. He thought about squeezing the rope lines together in the center with his fingerless glove-covered right hand, but then thought better of it at seeing how fast the ropes were moving. At that moment, they cleared the peak of the pyramid, and the wind whipped them back and forth as it pushed relentlessly. Both men experienced vertigo as they watched the massive building fall away beneath their feet. "I advise action," said Aethelgard. "We shall certainly have to add a braking mechanism in case this occurs again," said Actaeon as he considered his options to stop the wild ascent. "A bit late for that, don't we think?" "Perhaps not," said Actaeon. He had a sudden idea. Unsheathing his hooked dagger from his belt, he cut through the fabric of his vest on each side of his upper chest, between the front opening and the armholes. He returned the dagger to its sheath and yanked the vest free. "Steady me, Aethelgard." The night investigator did as instructed, hooking his legs under the bench and clutching the engineer's jacket on either side. Steadied thusly, Actaeon leaned forward and carefully looped the fabric of his vest around the 4 rope sections that were racing through the pulley system. He was careful not to let the vest touch the fast-moving ropes just yet. When he was ready, he pulled the fabric of the vest tight around the ropes and twisted. There was a snap, and the vest was torn from his hands. The pulley assembly ripped free from the underside of the bright weave sack frame and crashed down through the floor of the carrier, breaking the remainder of the bench assembly in two. Actaeon nearly fell after it, but Aethelgard yanked him back up against him. Together, they climbed up onto the remainder of their bench until they were straddling it. Please remind me never to do anything like this with you again, said the Arbiter. His face was pale. Somehow his lenses were still perched upon his nose. At the very least, it has been a major success, said Actaeon, smiling. A major success, blurted Aethelgard. We've lost half of our seat, we're smashed against the pyramid itself, and now we float untethered above the avenue of glass. If we were to fall now... I do not plan on falling, do you? Actaeon didn't wait for a reply before he continued. Perhaps you are correct, though. We could have surmised what we learned here without leaving the ground. What did we learn here? Demanded Aethelgard. Birds might not like to fly into the wind, but they take off into it in order to gain more lift, Actaeon explained. Aethelgard stared at Actaeon for several long life beats, as though he were an idiot. But then he slowly began to nod. So you mean to say that the killer flew into the wind to take off, and then back in the wind's direction? Precisely, started Actaeon, mimicking the night investigator. Shard was correct. No bird would fly into a wind like that, but they could use it to gain lift faster without requiring as much speed while on the ground, and once in the air, they could turn quickly to change direction, gliding upward along Pyramid Slope much as we did. Aethelgard grabbed Actaeon's shoulder and shook him again. Nicely done, engineer. So our killer didn't fly out to the boneyards after all. No, they flew in the exact opposite direction. With that thought, Actaeon unclasped his recurve bow from the back of his jacket and lifted it to gaze through the scope. Using it, he swept the terrain on the other side of the avenue of glass. A nice flat clearing in the windmoor, he pointed. Like there, that is where we should look for signs of our killer's landing. Agreed, said Aethelgard. Excellent deduction. But how do we get down? I have an idea, said Actaeon. I'm hoping for more than just an idea. We shall see if it comes to that. Normally, Actaeon would have wanted his halberd for something like this, but having left it with Enel back at the launch site, there was only one other option. He reached up to release the clasp that held the light lance in place, and pulled it down until it rested across his thighs. All right, I shall require your writhe blade for this. Why can't you just use the lance? Asked Aethelgard. I would prefer if we did not inadvertently cause our wayward vessel to rise again. If you say so, the Night Arbiter pulled the violently crackling weapon from its ceramic scabbard and carefully handed it to Actaeon. Actaeon accepted it and placed it so that its hilt was at the end of the light lance. Would you hold this in place? Aethelgard held both the light lance and the hilt of the writhe blade in place against Actaeon's thigh. The engineer then pulled out a length of glass rope and bound the writhe blade securely in place to the lance. When he was satisfied, he lifted the light lance and couched it in his lap. We had best commence our descent, lest we fly all the way to the Great Sea, as Enel feared we might. That said, he lifted the lance and used the writhe blade to pierce the bright weave balloon on either side to begin letting air out. Without any recent bursts of the light lance to heat up the air, the apparatus had already stopped rising and was just blowing in a southerly direction. Now that there were extra places for the hot air to escape, the lift started to descend. When he was sure of the rate of descent, he opened up 2 more holes to double it. We shall have to create a more permanent system for descent control flaps before our next flight, said Actaeon, as he looked down toward the ground to try to judge their speed. Ha! Snorted Aethelgard. There won't be a next flight for us. I'll wait for you on the ground in case that sort of insanity ever becomes necessary again. That is most unfortunate, given that you are now one of the 2 most experienced air navigators in all Redemption, said Actaeon with a grin. They approached the windmoor rather quickly. Actaeon unlashed the writhe blade and handed it back to the night investigator, who muffled its incessant crackling by sliding it back into its ceramic scabbard. The expanse of the plain was growing larger and larger as they rushed toward it. The wind was beginning to push them a bit westward now in addition to their southward trajectory, bringing them closer to the strange and varied ancient statues and clustered rock formations of the stone gardens. Actaeon lifted the light lance up and activated it to slow their descent. The wind carried them closer to the Elderstone sculptures as their impact with the Windmore was postponed. "Get ready to leap clear from the float just before we impact," said Actaeon. Aethelgard grunted but perched himself up on his good left leg to be ready to do as the engineer instructed. Just before the balloon struck the ground, Actaeon tossed the light lance to the side, and both men leapt clear of the apparatus. Actaeon rolled onto his side, while Aethelgard landed on his bad leg and cried out in pain before flopping onto his back. The remainder of the float lift's bench broke in half when it hit the ground. The bright weave bubble continued to drag it until it wrapped around a nearby cylindrical statue some 300 paces from them. The wooden substructure beneath the bright weave bent and cracked. "Shattered redemption, my leg! I landed right on my bad leg," shouted Aethelgard, tears rolling down his cheeks from the pain. Actaeon rushed to the knight's side and felt his leg, causing Aethelgard to pull himself up into a seated position and shove him away angrily. "Darkest hour take you! What are you doing?" he cursed. "Just checking to see if it is broken. It is not. You must have just strained it," explained Actaeon. Reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, he withdrew a half-through vial and handed it to the night investigator. "Drink this. It should help the pain." "You always carry that with you in case you bust up an old man's leg after flinging him over the pyramid?" griped Aethelgard. "Precisely," responded Actaeon as he fell back onto his elbows beside the Arbiter and pulled his goggles up to rest on his forehead. Aethelgard regarded him skeptically, but popped the cork and quaffed the medicine anyway. In the distance, the fabric of the bright weave fluttered violently against the stones. The sun started to set to the west, stretching long shadows from the stones onto the plain before them. After some time had gone by, Aethelgard laughed. "I haven't had that much fun in cycles." "That is the drug speaking," said Actaeon with a grin. Aethelgard slapped Actaeon on the back. "Maybe so, but it still stands true." "So you will go on the next flight with me after all?" asked Actaeon. Aethelgard gave Actaeon a playful shove. "Don't push your luck, young man. Now help me up and let's go see what remains of your flying machine." After Actaeon helped him up, Aethelgard leaned heavily on his left shoulder, and the two men walked toward the looming Elderstones. "Stop!" commanded Aethelgard, when they were but halfway there. Actaeon halted and arched a brow. "What is it?" "This way," said the investigator enigmatically. He yanked Actaeon to the west, using his companion as a crutch. The Arbiter led the way into a field of stones, weaving the way from shadow to light and from light to shadow. And when he stopped and leaned heavily upon his companion's shoulder to gaze upward, Actaeon gasped at what he saw. Impaled atop the sharp point of a conical Elderstone pillar was a winged figure. She was a slight woman wearing a simple woven shift that was fastened around her waist with a hide belt. Her body was locked in a fetal position around the spike where it entered her belly, and an expression of excruciating pain was frozen upon her features. One of her shoes was missing, and in her hand was held a crossbow in a white-knuckled death grip. Her scalp was clean-shaven, but her features were clearly Shieldian. Below her body, the stone was stained red with her lifeblood, which ran down to a dried pool at its base. The most shocking part of the scene, though, were the shimmering wings that extended out on either side of her body. They protruded from an artifact backpack that was strapped onto her shoulders and hips. A rainbow of colors reflected from elements on each wing, glimmering in the sunlight like the scales of a fish as they rippled in the wing. "Poor girl," said Aethelgard. "She tried so hard to kill herself after ending up in this predicament, but to no avail." "How do you know?" asked Actaeon, bewildered. "Observe how worn the fingers of her left hand are." Aethelgard pointed up with his free hand. "She worked them raw, trying to pull the stirrup of the crossbow to load another bolt. In the end, she didn't have the strength. With this sort of injury, it might have taken her a long time to die." Circumstances brought her to a just end, then, said Actaeon. I'm not so certain, said the night investigator. If my suspicions are correct, it was likely that she was justified in this killing. If it was justified, then why try to solve this murder? Asked Actaeon, genuinely confused. Justified or not, it stands against the laws of the pyramid, he explained. There is only one acceptable manner in which to resolve such conflicts, and that is in a declared duel, in the public eye, under the supervision of a night arbiter. Allowing a violent conflict resolution in any other way invites war, combat, and assassination to the neutral territory of the pyramid, beyond what the order of arbiters could ever hope to control. And thus, the killer must be punished. That makes sense, said Actaeon. In either way, it appears that a punishment is no longer necessary. The public must still have an answer to this case, insisted Aethelgard. Here, help me get her down from there. The stars had come out by the time they managed to bring the dead killer down. It had taken Actaeon some time to pull out some of the broken support structure from the bright weave balloon and fashion a ladder from it. It took even longer to dislodge the corpse, frozen in rigor as it was, from the Elder Stone. It was an unpleasant operation that Actaeon had to conduct entirely on his own, given Aethelgard's injury. He'd been around death plenty of times, but handling a body like this was different and markedly disturbing. When the dead killer was finally on the ground, Aethelgard hobbled over to inspect her body. On it, he found an artifact and a folded note. Once he was done reading it, he handed it to Actaeon. We have somewhere we need to go in the morning. After he finished reading, Actaeon offered him a somber look and nodded. The next morning, the unlikely pair found themselves in the open markets outside of the pyramid. Aethelgard leant more heavily on his cane than the previous day as they traced their way between the colorful stalls and past noisy shoppers hauling wares and haggling over prices. Actaeon unfolded the note again to review it. It read, Unira, if you're reading this letter, then I have failed. My hope was to make sure that history could never repeat. The artifact I found was to be the key, but alas, it was not to be. If our detractor ever does come to power, then promise my fallen soul that you'll go somewhere far, far away. What I did for you. Please remember that. I'm so very sorry. On Shell. After a quick stop at Grimira's shop, Actaeon's old blacksmith friend told them where to find an Enira in a small tent near the Warrens, where she sold pottery. Grimira insisted that they stay for a too-warm ale to toast her late husband Balin. Both men gulped it down with forced smiles and thanked her before leading on their way. The young woman sat beneath a low tent in a deep-seated chair before a table covered with a variety of pottery, bowls, and bottles. Her features were clearly Shieldian, and she had ear-length black hair and curious dark brown eyes. She wore a simple brown shift. Might I interest you gentlemen in a carafe, or perhaps some bowls? She asked, flashing them a smile, stacked with faux charm. Unira, I presume? Began Aethelgard. He leaned forward heavily on his cane to inspect the wares and the girl. Your back is broken, I didn't know. Yes, She paused, unsure at first what to say. Why would you, how do you know that? All of it. I am Night Investigator Aethelgard, with the Order of Arbiters, he said, placing a hand on his chest. And this is my associate Actaeon. He is helping me with an investigation. Your condition is obvious by the dirt at the bottom of your dress, the size of your biceps, and the fresh dirt under your fingernails, not to mention your lack of ability to hold posture and the design of your chair. At the mention of the Order of Arbiters, Unira's eyes fell to her lap, and she brushed a lock of hair from her face. Then Hanshell is caught, or worse. It is my deep regret to inform you that both are true, explained Ethelgard. He pushed his lenses up along his nose as he regarded her. Hanshell was to be apprehended for her crime, but, in finding her, we discovered that she had died. I'm sorry for your loss. She was your lover, no? Unira's eyes filled with tears, and she tried to hide her face against her right shoulder. How could you possibly have ascertained that? Asked Actaeon, incredulous. Why, it is quite simple, my technically minded friend, said Ethelgard. He turned his friend toward his companion and lowered his voice to give Unira a moment to take in the news. The signs were everywhere, in the note where Hanshell lingered on her lover's name with her hand, taking the time to get it perfect. It was also neater than the rest of the words in the note, because she took special care to get it right. There are a number of observations to be gained from the handwriting. The deep regret she felt when writing that she failed, and the anger she felt as she wrote about their detractor was made with more pressure that cut deeper into the parchment. On the other hand, the fear that she felt as she told Unira to go far away, and the sadness in the final words was left with wispy, lighter strokes, not to mention that Unira here blushed when her partner's name crossed her lips. Actaeon arched a brow and looked back toward the young woman. Unira used the sleeve of her shift to wipe the tears from her eyes before she looked back up at the two men and nodded. The Arbiter speaks the truth. She and I were lovers. I cannot say that I'm surprised. I warned her against this foolish task, but she insisted. Can you tell me at least? Did she succeed? Ethelgard's lips curled into a sad smile, and he nodded. Cregan is dead. At his words, Unira's head fell back, and she clutched both of her hands to her chest. A weight has been lifted from my heart. Thank you, Knight Arbiter. Actaeon offered her the note and the artifact, which she accepted. She clutched the artifact to her chest. It was a palm-sized metallic disc with a hexagon of prismatic elderglass at the center. Holding it brought tears to her eyes again. I can't thank you enough for bringing this to me. It would be thanks enough if you allowed me to design you a chair with wheels, said Actaeon. You could use it to propel yourself without having to crawl or carry yourself on your arms. I could send a wagon to come pick you up and bring you to my workshop in the outskirts for a fitting. Unira smiled sadly at him. You must be the prince engineer that I've heard about. I'd not normally take you up on such an offer, but I've heard of the things that you can do. I'd be a fool not to. She spread both hands in a gesture at the marketplace around them. It will be done then, said Actaeon. In return, I would ask that you keep me apprised of any issues with the device and whether there are any improvements you could wish. Unira nodded. Thank you. We shall let you be then, to mourn your loss, said Ethelgard, tugging Actaeon's sleeve. Before you go, started the Shieldian, may I tell you our story, the story that drove Hanshell to kill that evil man? It is important that you know that she was a good person. Ethelgard paused and nodded. I believe I know most of it already, but I would like to hear some of the details directly from you to assess the veracity of my conclusions. Unira set the note and the artifact upon her lap and began to recount her story. Hanshell and I were both from Rust, she began. We were the closest of friends as children, growing up together with the lessons of S.H.I.E.L.D., working in my parents' pottery shop and learning blades from Hanshell's parents, who were soldiers. It was a simple life, but a good one, and I loved it. It wasn't until we began to come of age as young women that we began to realize something was wrong. Our parents both started to daydream aloud about who we would marry to strengthen our households. It left a knot in my stomach thinking about how it would change everything, and that I'd not be able to spend so much time with my dear friend. I didn't know what to do, though. It was Hanshell who took the first step. She was always the strong one. She brought me to an old rusted structure where we used to play fort as young children. There she told me that she loved me, not just as a friend, but as the person she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. At first, I didn't understand what she was implying. I loved her too, and I felt a growing attraction to her, but Shieldians are duty-bound to pair off as men and women, in order to produce the next generation of warriors to fight for our people. Anything else is seen as a failure of that effort, and so a relationship between two girls would never be accepted in our dominion. So you ran away together to the Underforest, said Ethelgard. Unira and Actaeon both looked at him, surprised. An easy deduction, said the night investigator. You both have discoloration and scarring on your feet and legs, and in that case on your forearm, he said, pointing. Caused, no doubt, by jungle route from your extended time there, coupled by poor nutrition and cleanliness. Plus, it was the obvious close place to flee to, and the location you were likely abducted by the Chernians and sold into slavery, given their presence in the Underforest at the time as the children's protectors. We survived there alone for many months, nodded Unira. We built a small treehouse, held our own joining ceremony, and learned to hunt and snare animals. But in the end, the rains of the monsoon season were too much. Our treehouse wasn't able to withstand the torrential downpours. After it collapsed, we began to struggle with being constantly wet, often sick, and with never enough food. When I was out checking snares one day, I came across the band of hunters and decided to approach them. It was stupid, but I was little more than a child, plus miserable and desperate. In my mind, I'm not sure what I'd hoped for. I had nothing to offer them in trade, but I had never encountered anyone before outside of the safety of S.H.I.E.L.D. These hunters were nothing like that. They took me captive immediately, bound me, and made me do all the work in their campsites as they continued onward, away from their home in the jungle. I came to learn they were Chernians, the boogeymen that I'd always heard about, who captured children and even lost adults and made slaves of them. I never expected that they'd be in the Underforest, but I learned that these ones were traveling from a place called Temple, where they had finished serving a watch over the Underforest. The men, and some of the women even, joked about using me, but there were 2 women among them who kept everyone from doing so. They told the other Chernians that I would be more valuable if they didn't do that. At one point, one of the men grew frustrated and tried to take advantage of me in the night, but one of the women fought him and ended up crippling his weapon arm. That is awful if you had to live like that and were taken away from your partner, said Actaeon. Yes, it was, said Unira. I'd never before lost all hope. I shouldn't have, though. Handshaw was captured following you, then? Asked Ethelgard. Hold on, said Actaeon. How could you know they were both Chernian slaves? You mean aside from it being the entire motive behind the crime? Asked Ethelgard with a knowing smirk. When we found Handshaw, she was missing a shoe. Did you notice anything about her foot? Actaeon thought for a moment, then shook her head. Chernian slaves are marked, typically on their feet, he explained. I noticed the tattoo on Hanshaw's foot immediately, a pattern undoubtedly belonging to her former owner. Unira here is wearing simple sandals, so you can see the markings on her feet where she sits. Actaeon leaned forward to peek over the table full of pottery and noticed that Unira's feet were indeed tattooed with a pattern of triangles. I see. That's how I concluded the killer was justified in the killing as well. Kragan was one of your captors, was he not? Ethelgard tugged his short beard and turned his attention back to the Shieldian. You are quite the observer, night investigator, Ethelgard, said Unira. My job is to observe, said Ethelgard. Yes, Kragan was the leader of the group that captured me. A shield warden, they called him, continued Unira. And not 5 days after I'd been captured, the same Chernian woman who had protected me against rape caught Handshaw tracking us through the Underforest. They bound her too and tried to make both of us serve them. When Handshaw refused, they beat her. I convinced them to leave her be and worked twice as hard to make their travels easier. While Handshaw was kept bound, I worked to set up their camp, cook their food, clean their clothing, and break their camp at the beginning of the next day. Handshaw was furious with me for it, but I couldn't bear to let them hurt her again, so I did my best to make them happy. Often, she was kept gagged, but in the rare moments that I got to speak with her, Handshaw would tell me of her plans to escape and urge me to steal a knife for her. I was too scared, though. I didn't have the courage of my Aunt Shell. She would keep fighting no matter what, but all I could imagine was the horror of having to watch them kill her and take her from me. And so, they took us like that all the way through the ruins to Craters. I overheard them speaking once that they wanted to sell us far away from S.H.I.E.L.D. to prevent someone we knew from ever encountering us again. Once arrived, we were both sold off, and I didn't see her for cycles after that. A terribly mean man bought me and made me his wife. He was handsome for a man, and I did my best to fit into my new role. His other wives explained to me that if I did not give myself to him fully, I would not be treated kindly. And so, I tried. I really tried. But when the night came that he decided to bed me, I couldn't do it. That was not for him. It was only for Aunt Shell. And my refusal triggered his anger. He beat me so badly that he broke my back. I still remember the feeling of his boot slamming into my back, the sharp blast of pain that traveled up to my skull and caused my ears to ring. It was the last time I felt my legs. His other wives took care of me and nursed me back to health. After that, he was not interested in me. He'd make me lie in the corner and throw me table scraps like a dog. I was in charge of cleaning the floor and massaging his feet when he came home. I did this for cycles. During that time, he killed 2 of his other wives in rages that he fell into. There had been 5 wives in total, including me. I started to recognize when he was closer to his trigger point, and I'd find something to do well away from him. It kept me alive. Until Aunt Shell rescued you, said Aethelgard. Need I even tell the story? Asked Unira. Please do, said the night investigator. There are details I wish to hear if I've gotten the truth of. Aunt Shell had escaped her enslavement within weeks, she continued, but it took her many cycles to find me and formulate a plan for my rescue. My master was eating his evening meal while we served him. I had just finished filling a basin with warm water and slid it over so he could soak his feet when I noticed the water had turned red. When I looked up, there she was, my Aunt Shell. The man who had broken my back and so tormented me all those cycles was staring down at a bolt that protruded from his chest. Aunt Shell reloaded the crossbow and had the other 2 women move to the corner and lie on their stomachs, where she bound and gagged them. After that she hugged and kissed me and wept about what had been done to me. I felt a relief wash over me that I didn't know would ever be possible again in my life. I'm here for you, Neri, she said. I'm so very sorry I couldn't stop him from hurting you. After I reassured her that it wasn't her fault, she set the remainder of her plan into action. She loaded me into a wheelbarrow and emptied a sack of potatoes atop me until I was well and buried. Then she rolled me away. When we reached the boneyards, she rolled me a ways into the ruins until it became too rough. Then she pulled me out and bound me onto her back. And thus, my brave, strong Aunt Shell bore me off into the wreckage of redemption and away from our tormentors. It took us days journeying like this, but Aunt Shell had found places for us to camp out at intervals all throughout the ruins, where she had stashed some food for us. 4 days into the journey, Aunt Shell was knocked from her feet, and we both tumbled to the ground as the very earth beneath us shook. A tremendous blue sphere expanded to our north, from whence it came. It grew to fill the entire sky over Charon, and then shattered into a million glittering pieces that rained to the ground. We later learned that the blue sphere had destroyed all of the Chirnians and their slaves. Aunt Shell had come to rescue me, not a moment too soon. Had she taken any longer, then I would have been annihilated with the rest of my tormentors. Eventually, we found ourselves in the shadow of Pyramid. From there we made our way to the Warrens, where we hid and celebrated being back in one another's arms. When word trickled to us that the Chirnians were dead, we had even more cause to celebrate. Aunt Shell helped me open up the shop. We thought we were free at last. That was until Aunt Shell heard from her connections in the Warrens that our former captor, Kragan, was bringing together scattered Chirnians to try and restore the dominion that had taken so much from us. I tried to talk her out of it, but in the end I knew it was futile. My Aunt Shell would never rest until this threat to us was eliminated. She showed me an artifact she had found more than a cycle ago in the boneyards while searching for places for us to camp safely during our escape. The flying suit, said Actaeon. That's right, said Unira before continuing. Before she left, I told her that she didn't have to do this, that she could just stay here with me and hide. The words she said next still hang in my mind, like she said them just a life beat ago. We shall never be free to live our lives so long as men who would take everything from us exist. And that is why I must kill him. I didn't know what to say, and so I wished her luck and sent her off with love. But how I wish now that I had argued with her. I would have told her that there were other heroes in this world, and that I needed mine at my side. I know she could not have accepted that, but I might have tried harder. I know that now. There were tears in her dark brown eyes. She killed him in the end, said Actaeon, to protect you. Yes, she did, and in doing so, left me forever alone. She spoke through a sob. Actaeon reached out to touch her shoulder, and she placed a grateful hand atop his as she cried. Aethelgard pointed to the artifact in her lap. The artifact she stole from Cregan. It had meaning for you both, didn't it? What was so special about it? Actaeon arched a brow at his companion. What? Asked Aethelgard. The fibers on it are obviously from Cregan's tunic. Of course they are, said Actaeon. In the future I shall have to pay better attention to tiny fibers on artifacts that I find. I should certainly hope so, Aethelgard spat back. Unira wiped the tears from her eyes and lifted the disc into the air in one palm. When she waved her hand over the elderglass prism in the center, it lit up in a bright blue luminance, and two life-size figures appeared in the air floating above it. Several nearby bystanders gasped. A few people fled, while more gathered around behind the two men to watch. The two figures were Unira and Aunt Shell, Actaeon realized. Aunt Shell's projection knelt before Unira's and held her partner's hands within her own. I love you to the ends of this world, pronounced the projection, and I will ever be your shield. Unira swiped her hand over the prism, and the projections disappeared. I love you to the ends of this world, she whispered. She regarded the device in her palm for several long moments, in disbelief that she was holding it. Cregan took this from me after he captured me in the Underforest. I'd never thought I would see it again. The crippled girl smiled sadly up at Actaeon and Aethelgard. This was her final gift to me. I'm free.